Hello and welcome back to the Better Brain Blueprint. In today's episode, we are covering what I believe is the single most important topic of this entire series, and that topic is mental health. So why would I, as an internal medicine doctor, feel like mental health is all that critical? Well, if you consider what is most important to you, what makes your life meaningful, what are you really talking about? You're talking about the things that support good mental health, that make your life enjoyable. Simply put, if we don't have good mental health, none of the other stuff matters. So this is why it's absolutely vital that we talk about mental health and the steps we can take to improve our mood, decrease symptoms of stress and anxiety, and overall enjoy our lives a little bit more. This is all the more relevant in the culture we live in today, where we're far more interested as a population in increasing GDP than we are in happiness or life satisfaction, or where we're so quick to base our life success and therefore our contentment what we see other people doing on TV or social media. Our culture just doesn't prioritize mental health. And instead, it makes it incredibly easy to do all the things that are linked to anxious mood, depressed symptoms, and high levels of stress. This helps to explain why hundreds of millions, if not billions of people are suffering from poor mental health right now. This is unacceptable. We can and we must do better. And in today's episode, we'll be speaking with mental health experts who can tell us all about the breakthrough research that we can and should be using today to improve our mood and to decrease our risks for mental health issues. This is really important stuff, and I just can't wait to share it with you. I am Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and this is the Better Brain Blueprint.
Having a healthier brain feels empowering,
limitless,
inspiring.
It feels peaceful and it feels hopeful.
It is so essential to your health.
Your brain is your greatest asset.
Improve your brain.
Improve your brain.
improve your brain.
Improve your life.
Improve your life.
There is no alternative.
Live better longer.
You deserve that.
In this episode, we'll be covering powerful, life-changing information. Remember, if you want full access to the Better Brain Blueprint now and for years to come, you can invest in the entire series, along with the exclusive bonus materials right now for a special price that is only available during this broadcast. Don't wait. Your brain will thank you. All too often, we see this false divide between the mind and the brain. Yet, here's the reality. Your mood is a direct outgrowth of your brain state. And what I mean is that mental health is not separate from brain health or physical health. To prioritize mental health, we have to look at this bigger picture. And it means going beyond DNA and genes and considering all the variables that make us feel the way that we feel.
Mind, body, and brain, how are they connected? It's such a root of stigma. And because we haven't understood the mind and we haven't understood how things exactly like depression or anxiety work, because we all have personal experiences, and because there's so much fear.
Thank goodness we now know that the mind and the body are completely connected. And when we actually acknowledge that, it becomes much easier to treat illness because we start to understand how they're connected and how influencing a part of the body or the brain can actually have downstream impact on the rest. What we see is that stress impairs memory formation and the translation of short-term memories into long-term memories. So over time, if that's one of the most important things to know about long-term chronic stress issues, is that it has lots of impacts on the body that are negative or destructive and disease-causing, but it actually impairs our memory more than anything else, and usually very quickly.
When I think about mental health, I don't think of it as a genetic chemical destiny. I think that states like depression and anxiety are symptoms. They are communications from the body, and they're communicating some degree of imbalance. And that imbalance can be on the level of the physical body, or it can be a psychospiritual imbalance, some fundamental human need that's going unmet. And so to me, states like depression and anxiety, they are not an entity. They are a communication, they're a symptom. And it doesn't tell us what you have. It tells us how your body manifests a certain degree of imbalance. And the imbalance is something we have to investigate and understand what is off in your body, in your psychospiritual life, And once we identify it, we can address it at that level and often eliminate a lot of unnecessary suffering. But in the case of those psychospiritual needs, in an even more profound way, we can start to get somebody back into alignment. We can course correct where their life has veered off course.
Parts of the brain that are activated by stress are really almost all parts of the brain, because not all stress is treated the same in the brain, and the kind of experience we have dictates which parts of the brain are active. So if it's a visual stress or a smell stress, like a bad smell would be like a smell stress, that is activating completely different sections of the brain. Same with sound, same with touch, same with taste, and same with like a predator chasing the jungle. They're all activating different parts of the brain. But in the short term, what happens when we're stressed is one particularly important part of the brain is activated, which is a part that's one of the oldest parts of our brains, going back to ancient reptiles, and it's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is at the core, near the center of our brains, that is helping to detect. We often think of it as fear, but it's really seems to be more like newness or unfamiliarity, uncertainty in our environment. And so the more uncertainty, the more this part of the brain lights up, because evolutionarily, when we were in the jungle again, or when our monkey ancestors were in the jungle, when newness was around, things in the environment that were unfamiliar to them, they had to pay attention to what those things were very quickly, because they didn't know what those things were right away. And if they didn't, then that could compromise themselves and their entire, animal family. And so how do we do that? Well, we have a part of the brain, the amygdala, that detects newness and uncertainty and unfamiliarity in the environment. If unfamiliarity by default will trigger a fear response before it triggers a safety response, because, again, if something's uncertain to us in our environment, it could end up hurting us and causing problems. So we always default to that. The body always defaults to a fear response before safety.
It's important that we are honest about the incredible burden of mental health around the world. Even prior to the recent pandemic, mental health was poor. Rates of anxiety and depression were on the rise, especially in younger populations. But the stress and the burden of the pandemic has really exacerbated these issues. One recent meta-analysis looked at a host of different studies to gauge the global prevalence of mental health conditions. They found that rates of depression were around 27%, rates of psychological distress at 30%, rates of insomnia 22%, and rates of anxiety were 25%. Even though these numbers may change each year a little bit, they are staggering. Add this to the recent data from the American Psychological Association showing that around 72% of adults are experiencing health effects due to stress, and you realize that we're not in a good place as a planet or even locally in the United States. Of course, the next step is to ask why. Why are so many people having such a hard time? There are many reasons, but some are pretty easy to point out.
We were never meant to be exposed to data and information and news cycle 24/7. It's like we never get a rest from it. And that is going to definitely, and I see this in my patients all the time, it's going to increase our adrenaline, it's going to increase our cortisol beyond what would be normal. And we know that that also can be detrimental to our immune system, can increase levels of anxiety and depression. So I would say those are really the big things.
So there are a whole host of factors, including genetics, serotonin. Many do play a role, although I will say that there's some studies that have recently come out that are starting to challenge the serotonin hypothesis for depression. Environmental factors. I mean, if someone has just gotten laid off from their job, or if they've endured a divorce, that can definitely contribute to depression.
We've always had catastrophic storms. We've always had tornadoes and typhoons. Those are throughout history, droughts and blizzards. But there's something about both the intensity of what's happening in our climate and the way that affects our everyday. If it is 120 degrees for 2 weeks, that completely changes your day, your routine, your needs for hydration. Short questions, are things getting worse? Probably. things are getting worse. We also, part of that is we have more awareness. And then part of that is that people have a language to express it. And part of reducing stigma is asking people to step forward. I was involved with a wellness intervention once, and we were talking about outcomes and goals. And someone said, we're going to, and then we'll see the depression rate go down. And I was like, no, you won't. You're going to see the depression rate go up because you're asking people about it. You're offering free treatment. You're wanting people to engage in it. Hopefully you'll see the depression rate go up. If you give kids, particularly women, but I'm just going to say kids, anyone under the age 14, social media, their mental health gets worse. They're more suicidal. They cut more. They have more substance use. It's just pretty clear. And the data, I think everyone saw that, in the social network and then kind of moved on. I mean, when you see that, that individuals, kids in particular, are spending really years, days, dozens of full days every year really occupied with social media or making TikTok dance videos. It's hard not to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but it's concerning.
It's interesting that this is such an important time in history for mental health. After COVID, escalations of depression and anxiety are through the roof. And even though anxiety, for example, was the most common condition in the United States before COVID, it has escalated even further. So the topic of finding solutions for our improved mental well-being and our mental health are really critical for everyone right now.
Trauma is so enormous. I feel like it's the elephant in the room that I learned very little about when I went through my medical training. The way I think about it, there's a lot of poetic definitions of trauma, but I think of it most simply as overwhelming experience. Some overwhelming experience, sometimes an isolated event like a terrorist event, or sometimes a series of repetitive events such as adverse childhood experiences, neglect, abuse, and so forth. And even within that, there's the so-called small t trauma that, can be lesser events, but can still have significant impact, or large T trauma, like a rape or domestic violence, as an example. And I like Gabor Mate's way of describing trauma, where he says it's not so much about the event. It's about the way the event continues to live on in the body. And I would say, as a precision medicine clinician, that it's about the dysregulation that occurs after trauma. And we're still learning about that dysregulation.
In modern day, we don't have the same survival threats we had in the jungle. We have emails and news and too many responsibilities and all of these things that are not actually immediately threatening to us, but they cause like existential crisis and the idea of threat. And so our bodies actually didn't evolve to detect the difference. Our brains can detect the difference between real survival threat and the news, but our bodies can't. Our bodies respond the same way no matter what to all things, perceived threat or actual threat, which is really important to understand. So when we are reading an upsetting email and our stress response starts to go up, that means our body's taking blood away from our parts of our brains that are important for creativity and decision making and empathy, and sending them to the fear center and the skeletal muscle and the motor cortex and the heart and lungs. So when we're actually running from a bear, we want that to happen. When we're answering emails or giving a talk, we don't want that to happen. And if we have that resource allocation going to the stress response system, the sympathetic system, every moment of every day, which is not what happened when we were in the jungle, we're constantly depleting our entire parasympathetic nervous system of resources. And our recovery system is not getting any blood, and it's not getting any waste clearance. And we're still asking our reproductive system and immune system and digestive system to work, but we're not giving them the nutrients they need and not clearing the waste that they produce from doing the work.
The relationship between mental health and social media is such a fascinating topic. I've actually published a paper on this topic. And it's really interesting. I'd say at this point, there's no clear consensus whether or not social media is good or bad for mental health. It's not that black and white, although some people try to make it this reductionist type of argument. It's complex. It's complicated. Now, you do have a lot of credible psychiatrists and psychotherapists sharing really useful information on social media. But you also have a lot of junk out there about different diagnoses. And you have to think about the fact that, most people who are on social media, and I would even argue that most people who are struggling with anxiety or depression or another mental illness are not actually coming to see a therapist or coming to see a psychiatrist to clarify some of the stuff that they're seeing on social media.
As we've discussed previously, our mental state is a direct reflection of the structure and wiring of our brains, which is in turn a reflection of the building blocks and signals in our brains made by and influenced by food. The idea that food can impact our mental health isn't new, but it's only recently been gaining traction in conventional psychiatry, where it's been branded as nutritional psychiatry. At a very high level, we know from research that what we eat physically changes our brains, since our brains are built out of what we eat. We also know that our food powers our brain's energy and turns into neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. But now we're starting to understand that food can impact a number of master systems in the brain, from hormones to the immune system, giving us all the more reason to pay close attention to the link between our food and our mood.
So how does food affect our mental state? How is food involved with mental health and depression and brain health? And I talk about this with patients all the time. There are a lot of direct ways. For example, there's very significant evidence, including gold standard randomized controlled trials, that dietary pattern, what you eat, and I would also kind of how you eat, is directly correlated to your risk of depression in correlational studies. And in randomized trials, the improvement in terms of individuals who are in treatment and then get augmented with a dietary intervention, like the type we teach in nutritional psychiatry and in our e-course and the type our clinicians do, which is around helping people improve the nutritional quality of their diet. And I would say the studies are all about the Mediterranean diet, but I think we're in a non-dogmatic stance in nutritional psychiatry to really understand how someone is eating, understand where their motivations, goals, values, and skills are.
As we've just discussed, there are painfully high rates of mental health conditions around the world, yet not everyone is affected the same. Minority groups and men may be less likely to seek care and report mental health issues. Women are diagnosed with depression twice as often as men, but men commit suicide twice as often as women. Young women may be especially vulnerable to higher rates of mental health conditions. Those who identify as LGBTQ tend to have exceptionally high rates of depression and anxiety. All of these variables help inform the fact that mental health conditions are experienced differently by different people, and that there are important relationships between variables like gender, race, socioeconomic status, and even profession and risk for, as well as experience of, mental health conditions.
There's definitely a relationship between race and mental health, and that's something that's been there since the beginning of time, if you will. Jonathan Metzl wrote a really beautiful book called The Protest Psychosis, where he actually discussed the racialization of mental illness, how back in the 50s and 60s, more Black people were diagnosed disproportionately with psychosis and schizophrenia when what they were truly experiencing was depression, how different early pharmaceutical ads for strong antipsychotic medications would basically have subtle cues and, depict people with darker skin, for example, that would kind of in many ways be suggestive for physicians at the time that, hey, if you have a patient who looks a certain way, this is something that you should be thinking of.
There's sort of a myth of masculinity that in one way, aside from the mental health problems that men have, that I think a lot of men are confronting right now. What's it mean to be a man today? That's a really complicated question for my young patients in their 20s. Some of it is a little bit the same, as they date, and some of it's a lot different. And so I think they're really exciting opportunities for us in male mental health. We also can't sort of talk male mental health without talking about the suicide epidemic. When we look at the 50, 60, 70,000 deaths we have from suicide every year, 80% of those are men. And I think we haven't really thought so much. And they're men in sort of men and about our demographic, physicians in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. That is the most common demographic. And physicians or farmers are the two top professional groups when it comes to completed or death by suicide. And so understanding how to give men more resources to handle those symptoms and those feelings, understanding some of the basic safety around suicidal thoughts, substance use, depression, and then thinking about some of the specialized care that individuals need. And I think about all of our veterans. The top killer of our veterans is suicide. It's not war. And it's just such a tragedy. Is it something we know how to help people with, that we know how to treat? Incredible new science, incredible research coming out of places like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It's about your mental fitness. It's about controlling, understanding your mind, and optimizing gifts that you have to be best of service, both to yourself, but to those that you care about in your community. That's the goal of male mental health today.
An area of particular concern in the field of mental health conditions concerns the well-being of our younger generations. In particular, we've seen some concerning data coming out about mental health conditions in children and adolescents. Behavioral disorders like ADHD, eating disorders, as well as anxiety and depression are major considerations in the adolescent age demographic. One variable that's been proposed to be at play is how these younger people spend their time.
I don't know if certain populations per se are more vulnerable to mental health conditions, but what I will say is that with the rise of social media, that definitely has been somewhat of a double-edged sword there. I mean, you have people actually sharing their stories on social media, but again, if young people, if children, if adolescents have access to that in an early age, there's also a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there about mental health. Also, I think as more people start to open up and share their stories and mental health, mental illness becomes more destigmatized, I think that might also encourage other populations like adolescents or young people who would normally not approach their parents or talk to their friends about mental health and mental illness, actually start talking about it. And then that creates an environment where more people are getting treatment, more people are coming to see psychiatrists like myself. So, I think as mental health becomes less stigmatized, you're going to see some of those numbers rise and more people be diagnosed with mental illnesses like depression, anxiety. But the good news is, I think, as more people are diagnosed and get treatment, then we can start to, see some of those suicide statistics trend down in the right direction.
As we try to better understand the drivers of our mental health issues, one consideration is a simple but incredibly important question. The question is, how much of what we're experiencing is simply part of life, a normal reflection of the ups and downs in life's experience? When we're fixated on labeling people as having chemical imbalances in their brain, it may make it easier to prescribe a prescription, but harder to actually figure out what's driving the issue. Beyond this, many experts are now focusing on the difference between different types of mental states, especially anxiety. Here it might be useful to draw a distinction between a pathological, unhealthy anxiety that serves no purpose and a form of anxiety that's actually giving us important information about what's happening in our brains.
I get the question a lot about that distinction between clinical, true blue anxiety and just mild stress, worry, and that we're diluting the term when people use it to describe something that's not the real thing. And I actually bristle at that, and I tend to think that there's, of course, a difference in degree, but I don't necessarily think there's a difference in kind along that spectrum. And I think by focusing on that difference in kind, the implication is if you have real, true blue clinical anxiety, that this is a genetic chemical imbalance to be corrected with a pill. And I think that it overlooks the fundamental root causes of why we might be anxious, whether it's mildly anxious or severely anxious. And I think this gets at the issue with mental health as a field right now, is that we're really trying to squeeze mental health into this biomedical model and disease-based model where we're seeing our mental health issues as the result of a genetic chemical imbalance. And it implies that it's a fixed trait. It implies that our mental health issues are our destiny, that we're stuck. And if the treatments that are available, medication and therapy, work for somebody, then that model works for you. But in my experience in 10 plus years in practice as a psychiatrist is that I've observed far too many people who are not experiencing satisfactory relief from their symptoms under that model. And so then when you see things as, well, I'm broken, I have a genetic chemical imbalance, and it's supposed to be fixed with this pill, but this pill didn't fix me, people can start to feel pretty hopeless and they can start to despair. And I think it was actually an inaccurate narrative about mental health in the first place. And so even if we just look at the evidence-based determinants of mental health issues, it's a list that's so much broader than genetics or even just epigenetics. It includes how we're sleeping, how we're feeding our bodies, the degree to which we have inflammatory markers circulating in our bloodstream, how our hormones are functioning, all the way to more psychospiritual factors like, do we have community? Do we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives? What is our history of trauma and our ACE score?
Some anxiety is totally normal. So again, that's an area where it's important that we don't assign too much pathology to a normal human experience. We need anxiety in order to function. If I woke up on Monday morning and I had no anxiety or no motivation to go to work and see my patients, I would just lay in bed all day. So some level of anxiety is useful. Now, it becomes a mental health condition or mental illness when it starts to cause functional impairment, right? So if it's preventing us from being able to interact appropriately with our friends or family or go to work.
So distress and eustress are two words that we use to describe stress, because stress is really just challenge. It's challenging things that are happening to us in any given moment. And we live our whole lives dealing with and learning to overcome and adapt to stress and challenge. So eustress is the best way to think about it is it's stress that pushes us to grow and become stronger. It's stress that is provided to us or challenge on us that is provided in an overwhelmingly safe environment with support. Distress is the opposite of that. So it's the stress where we question our safety, we question whether or not we're okay if something happens within the stressful environment, and we don't have adequate support. And so that stress over time becomes stress that actually can keep us stuck or can stifle us. It can cause us to be in like fight or flight mode all the time, which can lead to lots of issues. But usually it starts with irritability, poor sleep, lots of racing fast thoughts, low mood or mood instability, anxiety, and things like that. So the more we can think about and identify these kinds of stressors and eliminate the distress and try to move as much as we can of the distress in our lives to challenges that we can safely overcome, then we can actually translate a lot of our stress into opportunities for growth, which is really exciting. And modern psychology has taught us a lot about how to do that.
I do loosely use an algorithm in helping patients identify what's true anxiety, what's false anxiety. And the idea is we start with false anxiety. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's the quick wins. And I think it even muddies our capacity for tuning into our true anxiety when our physiology is being pinballed around in every direction. Our minds, they are the consummate meaning makers, and they're here to make sense of stimuli. And when we are in a stress response in our body, that tracks up to the brain, and the brain, in an attempt to make sense of what is first and foremost a physical sensation, tells us a story about, oh yeah, I am anxious because of this thing happening at work and this interpersonal dynamic from the 7th grade that still irks me to this day. And so that story always has validity, but it's not actually the cause of our anxiety in that moment. It's a retrofitted justification. But it's important to validate it. So we can say my stressors are real, but also I did get a bad night of sleep and I am just coming out of a rabbit hole of doom scrolling. And I think that it's just helpful to cue you. Sometimes it's actionable, like you're hungry, have a snack. Sometimes it just takes the charge out of the situation. And as you start to address your false anxiety, it doesn't solve the problems in your life, but it certainly makes you more resilient in the face of them. And then it clears the air and allows you to tune into the true anxiety. And the true anxiety can have a different quality. This is sort of advanced, but I think that false anxiety, I almost think of it as having more of like a high frequency feeling, whereas true anxiety, it's a lower frequency. It's more of an intuitive hit of, I do realize if I'm really honest with myself and I slow down and I reflect, that this is an aspect of my life that doesn't feel right.
I think we need to be careful about overly assigning pathology to normal human behavior, right? I mean, now, while it may be useful to have a diagnosis to better explain why we think the way we think or why we behave the way that we behave, I think we also need to do a better job, I think, as psychiatrists who are on social media, or as people who are in the field on social media and educating large groups of people, explaining that there's nothing per se wrong with being a little different, right? There's a wide range of human behavior. And I think that's one of the things that also might get missed, or a myth that's created on social media platforms.
The Better Brain Blueprint is all about empowering you to lead a longer, better, happier, and healthier life. No matter your health history, you have the ability to improve your brain function right now by incorporating the information from this series into your daily life. This cutting-edge information just isn't available anywhere else. And that's why owning all of the expert interviews, the transcripts, and the supporting materials is so incredibly valuable. I highly recommend making the Better Brain Blueprint, along with the bonus materials, part of your family library. By making some simple lifestyle changes, you can create lasting improvements in your health and in your life. These changes may not only lower your risk for conditions like Alzheimer's and mood disorders, they will almost certainly improve your brain function right now. You might notice that you start thinking more clearly, forgetting less, and generally feeling better throughout the day. Sometimes the hardest part in taking action and making these lifestyle changes is figuring out where to start. If you're ready to start right now, the bonus materials include resources that will help you apply this knowledge to your life, one step at a time. We interviewed the world's leaders in general brain health, mood disorders, Alzheimer's disease, and more. And we received some fantastic, actionable information from each of our experts. Unfortunately, we didn't have room to include it all in this series, but we know it's critical, life-changing information that has the power to transform your health. That's why the bonus materials also include the full-length interviews from all of the experts you've seen throughout this series. The great thing about owning this series is that you can easily share it with friends and family and watch their lives change too. In fact, if you found this series helpful, I invite you to share this broadcast event with a friend or with your loved ones. You just might change their lives and their destiny. The most important investment in your life is an investment in your health. Click the button on this page to invest in your Better Brain Blueprint today. I want to make an important point. If you're out there and you're really struggling with your mental health, I highly advise you to seek professional help. Severe mental health issues can be life-threatening situations, and these are the scenarios where you really want an experienced mental health practitioner on your team. With this said, the research has made it clear that all of us can and should be taking steps to protect and improve our mental health each day. Just like our plan for preventing dementia, we should all be focused each day on how we can take steps to decrease our risk for developing mental health issues. The good news here is that the best studied strategies to help prevent conditions like depression turned out to overlap with the strategies to help prevent dementia. In fact, the best studied diet for depression prevention, and potentially even treatment, is the same diet that is known to be best for preventing dementia. In general, the research on this topic suggests that some of the optimal strategies to protect and improve mental health include eating a Mediterranean pattern diet, getting regular exercise, prioritizing high-quality sleep, spending time with loved ones, and engaging in regular stress mitigating activities. I truly believe that if everyone did these things, our collective brain health, including mental health, would be in such a better place. But don't just take it from me. Let's hear from our experts for their excellent tips on how to care for your mental health today.
I also have used bright light in the morning, which I think is really important, especially for people who live in more northern climates or places where it rains a lot, because we now know that there's a huge influence of bright light and the whole circadian rhythm and how that also improves our brain health and mood and immunity. So that's a really big one. I would say for me personally, I feel that, over the past 10 years, it's been stressful for lots of different reasons. And I myself have been, felt that very personally. And so I've tried to make it a huge part of my life to make sure that I'm taking care of myself in terms of self-care. So for that, for me, that means some meditation. It means some journaling. It means making sure I get outside every day, because no one's going to do that for you. And we were never meant to live in, inside all day in boxes and just, watch a computer all day long. And that really impacts our health tremendously in a negative way. So for me, I would say those are the things, is having those boundaries around making sure that I get outside, do some meditation, and try to modulate my stress as much as possible, because we know that excess stress is very damaging to our immune system, but also to our brain. So those are big things for me.
Most of the studies, just to get to it, look at the Mediterranean diet for depression. There are now 5 completed randomized trials. I would say nutritional psychiatry is exploding in terms of data. There are trials happening all over the country, ranging from Mediterranean diet to ketogenic diets, and thinking about dietary interventions in mental health. I have a simple rhyme: seafood, greens, nuts, and beans. It's not like, for anyone listening, probably it's big news that those are some of the great foods for our brain health, focusing on high quality proteins and high quality fats, and getting rid of the processed food is really a central tenet to your mental health plan.
If we can do nothing else right, maybe other than sleep, it's community. And this is one of our most potent medicines against anxiety, is to just make sure that we are really held by community. I think this has to do with our wiring as social creatures, that on that savanna of human evolution, we weren't the fastest species, we weren't the strongest species. We were the ones that figured out how to communicate and cooperate. And I think that cooperation speaks to why, when we feel held by community and richly connected, we feel safe. But then when we feel disconnected, isolated, ostracized, on some level in our DNA, it feels like it's a matter of life or death. And we've experienced the pandemic, which formalized social isolation and quarantining and putting us more in interactions with Zoom than with each other. And we do need to build back in-person community. It's not quite the same when it's happening through a screen. But also the pandemic was a pattern disruption, which helps us realize that it doesn't have to look the way it used to look. We get to write the script for ourselves. What actually fills our cup, what actually leaves us feeling fulfilled. Prioritize building that into our lives.
When someone we care about or love, a family member, a friend, is struggling with their mental health, what can we do? And I kind of think a two-pronged approach when I'm working with individuals. One is, how can we understand and support that individual in a way that they can accept? Because so often with mental health patients or people struggling with their mental health, it's a little like cancer. People are well-intentioned, but they just don't really say the right things. Talking just about your own mental health journey, or how hard it is, or how you understand it, or how you empathy, that's often not super helpful. Empathy is helpful, but so two-pronged approach of how can you understand that individual, their disorder or diagnosis, their particular situation.
My approach to thinking about the treatment of trauma is that it's both and. So it's the psychological approach, but it's also a physiological approach. And I think that when you approach it purely psychologically, sometimes you miss out on other opportunities. And the reverse is true. And then you look at the efficacy of something like MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's, we know somewhere around 2/3 to 80% go into remission with PTSD. So almost double the effect that you get with traditional talk therapy, almost double the effect that you get with a psychiatric medication that you're taking every day. To me, that is profound, and the effects are durable, right? So in the MAP studies, these folks with PTSD got, typically 3 treatments with MDMA. They're not taking a drug every day. And they have these durable effects a year or 2 out from treatment.
Getting help requires talking, requires communicating. And that's something that I think, if I'm generalizing, that men still struggle with, perhaps more than women do, opening up to their male friends about their vulnerabilities, their personal experiences.
The short answer is listening better. And as a listening professional, I spend 30, 40 hours a week listening, and I'm still working on getting better at it. We all have biases in how we listen. We all have really strong opinions about mental health. And so I encourage people to lose the stigma and the bias that you know a lot about what's going on. And sort of join me over here in the land of, I'd say, optimistic ignorance. I don't know what's going on exactly, but I'm going to sit with you and listen and be with you as you figure it out. And in the questions and the togetherness and the connection, something very healing happens.
Mindset really sets the frame for how we look at the world. We talk about the power of a growth mindset, just like we talked about the brain is neuroplasticity, has the ability to rewire itself through new stimuli and new thoughts and new behaviors. Same thing with our thoughts.
The health of our gut microbiome is integral to our mental well-being. We spoke about the connection between the gut and brain. Now, if we are consuming a fast food diet every day, the breakdown products of those fast foods are toxic to the gut. What that means is that the bad microbes in the gut are going to be excited because they've been fed sugar and unhealthy fats, the stuff that they love to eat. But when they thrive, they upset the environment in the gut, and you tend to develop not only inflammation, but dysbiosis in the gut. When this happens, this upset in the gut is when you often start to see an uptick in mental health symptoms, such as anxiety, for example. And I've had patients experience this when a patient, for example, got a promotion at work and started to do very well, but doing very well also meant that she was traveling a lot, not eating home-cooked meals and snacks, but eating in airports and fast food restaurants. And she noticed after time an uptick of symptoms, especially in anxiety. So there's a real correlation here, and the more that we can pay attention to building back in healthy whole foods and nutrients, the better our mental well-being will be.
Building resilience in general requires training ourselves to be better at adapting to stress. We will always have stress in our lives, whether it's psychological, emotional, physical, spiritual. There will always be financial. There's always be some kind of stress that we face in our lives. It never completely goes away. So the best thing that we can do is understand that stress is inevitable, it's going to happen, and just get really, really good at strengthening our muscles to adapt to it. Strengthening those adaptation muscles is what we call resilience. So building resilience literally means, especially if we're talking about to psychological or mental emotional stuff, stress, is really means like practicing understanding what we need to know about ourselves to not take things personally, not make expectations, always do our best, always be true to our word, always practice self-gratitude, self-forgiveness, self-compassion, self-love, and always do ourselves the honor of like remembering the core of cognitive behavioral therapy practices, which is effectively like, it's know thyself. It's don't let stuff into your consciousness that is not true and useful to you in this moment.
Male mental health is something that needs our attention and our focus. What we want to do is open up our arms, remind all of our brothers out there, it's not just as simple as like be vulnerable, but there is a very, very complex and satisfying, gratifying, powerful, potency-building path that you can get on as a man. It isn't just about your physical fitness.
On a scale of 0 to 10, how well are you coping with stress? Because I'll work with a client and I'll see if they're learning constantly and if they're protecting their brain, because that's on the other side of it, in terms of the darker side. But for their stress management, chronic stress shrinks the human brain. Chronic fear, if you're watching everything that bleeds, it leads on news and algorithms, there's an algorithm to social media. Whatever you engage with, they give you more of. Well, same thing with your mind. Your mind has an algorithm. If you're watching the news and everything else, you start seeing that darkness and that threatening, the things that are scary everywhere. And chronic stress shrinks the human brain. Chronic fear actually suppresses your immune system. Whole area of science called psychoneuroimmunology. It makes you more susceptible to colds, to flus, to viruses. So, how are we maintaining and coping with that? For me, meditation's top of the list. Some people like to work out. Some people like to foam roll, or they get some body work done. Maybe, just veg out and binge watch something. But how are you reducing that cortisol? So you're not in fight or flight, because when you're in fight or flight, you're in your survivor brain and you're almost being held hostage from your executive functioning, from your creative thinking, for your ability to be able to solve problems.
Mental health is absolutely fundamental to overall well-being, and I hope that by now you agree. Our mental health colors every aspect of our lives, affecting our relationships, our work, our life satisfaction, and everything in between. Yet in our society, we tend to marginalize mental health until things go dreadfully wrong. It's time to change that narrative and to commit to prioritizing mental health each and every day. Remember, some of the best studied strategies for good long-term mental health are simple daily habits that can be implemented right now. These include eating a whole food diet rich in a diversity of plants and healthy fats, prioritizing great sleep, getting regular physical activity, staying connected to others, and being kind to yourself. Again, as a reminder, if you're struggling with your mental health, consider reaching out to a health practitioner who can offer guidance and other assistance. This isn't a path to go alone.
I feel that everyone should be talking about how to prevent mental health issues, because if it's one thing that we learned during COVID, it was that there has always been this parallel and kind of hidden pandemic, a silent pandemic of sorts in mental health.
I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that we're all thinking about mental health, but we're not talking about it enough. And one of the cornerstones of my work is encouraging productive conversations about mental health, like the one that we've had today. And so I would just encourage anyone who's watching this, if you're thinking about mental health, find a way that you can open up a conversation about it, whether it's with a friend or a family or a loved one, or even on social media.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Better Brain Blueprint. I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next episode.